The rhythmic clatter of the wheels was a death rattle. For 3 days, it had been the only constant, a brutal iron heartbeat counting down the seconds of Thomas's life. Outside the grime-streaked window, the world was a blur of scorched earth and bleached sky, a merciless expanse that offered no solace. Inside the carriage, the air was worse, a stagnant cocktail of coal smoke, sweat, and the cloying sweetness of decay that clung to her husband. Alara kept a damp cloth over Thomas's forehead, a futile gesture against the fever that had already consumed him from within. His breaths were shallow, each one a small, sharp tear in the fabric of the silence between them. The other passengers, once politely curious, now cast furtive, pitying glances that felt like stones. They saw not a grieving wife, but a burden, an inconvenience. He stilled beside her as the train's whistle screamed its arrival, a long, mournful cry that echoed the one trapped in her own throat. The rattling shuddered to a halt. Thomas's hand, papery and cool in hers, went limp. There was no final word, no gentle sigh of release, just an abrupt and terrifying emptiness where his life had been. For a frozen moment, the world ceased to exist beyond the sudden weight of his stillness. Her own heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone, refusing to accept the silence from the man beside her. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the thick blanket of her grief. They were here, this desolate outpost, a boil on the flat, cracked skin of the territories, was where her world had officially ended. The conductor, a man with a face like curdled milk and eyes like chips of flint, appeared at her side before she could even form a thought. "We've arrived, ma'am," he said, his voice devoid of sympathy. He glanced at Thomas, his expression unmoved. "That'll be the remainder of the fare, and an extra fee for the trouble," he gestured vaguely at Thomas's body. The words were a physical blow. The last of their money had been spent on the tickets, on the quack doctor in St. Louis who had promised a cure that never came. Their shared purse, tucked deep in her satchel, held $3 and a handful of coins. Not enough for a room, not enough for a meal, certainly not enough to appease this vulture. I don't have it," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. His sneer was immediate, practiced. "Then you'll have to make other arrangements. The railway ain't a charity." His gaze roamed over her, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl, and she understood the kind of arrangements he had in mind. The whispers of the other passengers grew louder, a chorus of judgment. She was alone, a widow with empty pockets in a town that smelled of dust and greed. They would pick her apart. She would be swallowed by this place, another forgotten soul buried under the endless sky. A primal instinct, deeper than grief and stronger than despair, surged through her. She looked at Thomas's peaceful, gaunt face one last time, a silent apology passing between them. Then, clutching the thin strap of her satchel, she rose. Without a backward glance at the conductor's sputtering outrage, she pushed through the narrow aisle and stumbled down the steep iron steps onto the sun-baked platform. The town was before her, a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings that seemed to lean on each other for support. But she did not turn toward it. She turned away, toward the vast, empty wilderness that began where the town gave up. And she ran. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the unforgiving land. Alara ran until the burning in her lungs eclipsed the ache in her heart, until the sounds of the town and the train faded into the hum of insects and the whisper of the hot wind. Thorns tore at the hem of her dress, and the hard, cracked earth bruised the soles of her worn-out shoes. She had no destination, only a desperate, animal need to put distance between herself and the life that had just collapsed behind her. The satchel, containing all that was left of her world. A spare chemise, Thomas's tarnished silver watch, a tintype of their wedding day, bumped against her hip, a pathetic anchor in a sea of desolation. The grief, held at bay by the terror, now came in waves, a suffocating tide that threatened to pull her under. She stumbled, her vision blurring not just from the heat but from the tears she refused to shed. Finally, her body betrayed her. Her knees buckled, and she fell into a heap beside a cluster of skeletal greasewood. the dust rising to choke her. The world tilted, the brilliant blue sky swirling into a dark, welcoming abyss. When consciousness returned, it was in fragments. The first was an awareness of shade, a reprieve from the relentless sun. The second was the cool, blessed trickle of water against her parched lips, coaxed from the mouth of a metal canteen. Her eyes fluttered open to a vision framed by a wide-brimmed hat. A man knelt beside her, his face a landscape of its own, carved by sun and wind into something stark and unreadable. He was not young, nor was he old. His eyes, the color of the pale sky just before a storm, watched her with a calm, assessing neutrality. There was no pity in them, and more importantly, no avarice. He simply observed, like a hawk watches the ground below. When he saw her eyes were open, he withdrew the canteen and straightened up. He was tall and lean, dressed in functional, dust-colored clothes that made him seem a part of the landscape itself. "You can't stay here," he said. His voice was low and raspy, as if unused to conversation. It wasn't a question or a command, but a simple statement of fact. She tried to push herself up, but a wave of dizziness sent her reeling. Without a word, he offered a hand. His grip was firm, calloused, and impersonal. He helped her to her feet, his touch steadying but brief, and then gestured toward a solitary horse tethered nearby. There was no other choice. To stay was to die. She gave a small, jerky nod, and he accepted it as the only answer required. The journey to his homestead was made in a profound silence, broken only by the rhythmic plod of the horse's hooves and the creak of worn leather. He walked, leading the horse upon which she sat, her body swaying with a weariness that went bone-deep. She watched his back, the straight line of his shoulders, the easy, ground-covering stride that spoke of a lifetime spent in this unforgiving country. The landscape they moved through was vast and empty, yet he seemed to navigate it with an innate sense of direction, as if reading a map written in the language of rock and shadow. His home was not a ranch, but a small, solitary cabin tucked into the crook of a low mesa, almost invisible until they were upon it. It was built of sun-bleached wood and stone, stark and unadorned, with a small corral and a water trough nearby. It looked less like a conquest of the land and more like a quiet agreement with it. Inside, the sparse neatness was a surprise. A single room held a cot, a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, and 2 chairs. Everything had its place. It was the home of a man who lived with precision and without excess. He gestured for her to sit, then ladled water from a bucket into a tin cup and set it before her. He moved to the hearth, stirring the embers of a low fire and adding a few pieces of wood. He did not ask her name, nor where she came from. He did not ask why a woman in a travel-worn dress was collapsed in the middle of his wilderness. The questions hung in the air, unspoken, and in their absence, Alara found a strange sort of peace. His silence was not empty. It was a space she could occupy without the need for explanation or defense. It was the first kindness she had been shown in days. She drank the water, the coolness of it a balm to her raw throat, and watched the man who had taken her in. His name was Silas. She would learn later, but for now, he was simply a quiet presence, a shield against the vast, cruel world she had fled. The days bled into one another, measured not by a calendar but by the rising and setting of the sun. A silent routine began to form, an unspoken contract between 2 solitary people. In the mornings, Silas would rise before dawn, his movements quiet and deliberate as he tended to his horse and checked his sparse traplines. Alara would wake to the smell of brewing chicory and the sight of a bowl of corn mush left for her on the table. At first, she did nothing but sit, a ghost in his small cabin, lost in a fog of grief so thick it felt like drowning. But the sheer, unyielding competence of Silas's existence began to penetrate her sorrow. He wasted nothing. Not emotion, not a crumb of food, not a drop of water. His survival was a daily act of will, and watching him, a spark of that will began to kindling within her. She started with small things. She mended a tear in his shirt with the needle and thread from her satchel, her stitches clumsy at first, then growing more confident. She scrubbed the cabin's single window until the light streamed in, clean and clear. She found a patch of workable soil behind the cabin and, using a sharpened stick, began to turn the earth, planting the few hardy vegetable seeds she found in a sack in the corner. They rarely spoke. Words felt like an intrusion in the vast quiet that surrounded them. Their communication was a language of gestures and shared tasks. He would leave a bucket by the door. She would fill it from the well. She would leave a loaf of lopsided bread cooling on the hearth. He would eat it without comment, but the next day, a small sack of flour would appear on the table. One evening, she found him carefully repairing the sole of her shoe with a piece of thick leather. He worked under the lamplight, his large hands surprisingly deft, his brow furrowed in concentration. He did not look up as she watched him, but she felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a feeling so foreign she could barely name it. Gratitude. One afternoon, a dust cloud on the horizon signaled an approaching rider. A knot of the old fear tightened in her stomach. Silas, who had been cleaning his rifle by the door, went still. His eyes narrowed, and he watched the rider's approach with an unnerving calm. The man who dismounted was not a stranger. It was Finch, the portly, sweating land speculator who had sat across from her and Thomas on the train, his eyes always lingering too long. He swaggered toward the cabin, his gaze fixing on Alara with a greasy familiarity. "Well, I'll be," he sneered, ignoring Silas completely. "Thought I recognized the little runaway. Heard you skipped out on your bill." Finch's eyes swept the homestead, a calculating glint in them. "Hiding out here with this hermit? What's he got that's worth your while, little bird?" He took a step closer to her, his presence fouling the clean, dry air. "Town marshal's lookin' for you. Seems you owe the railway quite a bit. But maybe you and I can come to an arrangement." Before Alara could react, before the fear could swallow her, Silas moved. He didn't rise quickly. He unfolded himself, rising to his full height with a fluid grace that was almost menacing. The rifle was held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground, but its presence filled the space between them. "She's not going anywhere," Silas said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion, yet they carried the weight of a death sentence. Finch, startled, finally turned his attention to the silent man. He blustered, "This ain't your concern, old man. This is between me and the lady." Silas took one slow step forward. He did not raise the rifle. He did not need to. His eyes, cold as a winter river, were locked on Finch. "You're on my land," he stated. Leave. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Finch's face. He had expected a cowering woman and a withered old prospector. He had not expected this quiet, immovable force. He looked from Silas's unyielding expression to Alara, and for the first time he saw not a frightened victim, but a woman standing her ground, her chin lifted, her fear burned away by a cold, hard anger. She stood slightly behind Silas, a silent partner in this standoff. Finch licked his lips, his bravado crumbling. He took a hesitant step back, then another, before scrambling onto his horse. "This ain't over," he spat, but his threat was hollow. He spurred his horse and galloped away, kicking up a cloud of angry dust that soon settled back into the profound, victorious silence. The dust settled, and the vast, empty quiet of the land rushed back in to fill the space Finch's venom had occupied. The immediate threat was gone, but a new tension hummed in the air between them, the aftermath of a battle fought and won together. The setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the stark landscape in hues of bruised purple and soft rose. Alara watched Silas as he calmly finished cleaning his rifle, his movements as steady and unhurried as before. He had not just protected her. He had defended their shared space, this fragile sanctuary they had built from silence and routine. He had stood as a bulwark against the cruel world she had fled, and in doing so had affirmed her place within his. That evening, as they sat at the small table, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, the silence was different. It was no longer a space born of necessity, but one of comfort and deep, unspoken understanding. She found her voice, the words feeling fragile in the quiet room. "Thank you," she said, her gaze fixed on her hands, which were clasped on the table. "Not just for today. For everything." Silas looked up from his plate. He didn't offer a platitude or a dismissal. He simply held her gaze for a long moment, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something beyond his stoic reserve. A shared recognition of loss, of the need for solitude. "A man tried to take this place once," he said, his voice a low rumble. "When I first built it, said it was his by right of some paper he had. Paper don't mean much out here." He looked around the small, sturdy cabin. "What you build, what you defend. That's what's yours." It was the most he had ever offered about himself. A small, polished stone of his past placed carefully between them. It was enough. It was everything. Later, as she lay on her cot, the satchel with Thomas's watch and their tintype felt less like a monument to what was lost and more like a marker of the journey that had brought her here. She was no longer the terrified woman who had fled the train. The grief for Thomas was still there, a quiet, abiding ache, but it no longer defined her. The harsh sun and the hard work had stripped away her old life, leaving behind something stronger, something more resilient. The next morning, she rose with the first pale light. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked piece of mirror Silas had nailed to the wall. The woman who looked back was weathered. There were new lines around her eyes from squinting into the sun, and her hands were calloused from working the earth. But her eyes were clear. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet strength, a deep-rooted calm. She was no longer a victim adrift in a hostile world. She was a survivor. She had found her ground. She walked outside into the cool morning air. Silas was already at the corral, mending a loose rail on the fence. He looked up as she approached, and a faint, almost imperceptible softening touched the corners of his mouth. She picked up a tool without being asked and stood beside him, ready to help. Salvation, she realized, did not always arrive with a trumpet's call. Sometimes it came quietly, in the form of a canteen of water offered in the desert. It was found in the shared silence of a simple meal, in the steadfast presence of a decent man, in the unexpected discovery of one's own will to endure. The future was still a vast, unknown territory, but standing here, beside him, under the immense and watchful sky, it no longer felt terrifying, felt like home.